guys, welcome to week 40. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope it's just really refreshing to be in the New Testament. Every year that I do this, I get to this point where I'm like, when will the Messiah come? And then the New Testament comes and I open it and I read it and it's just like a revival. So anyway, some stuff to touch on this week. John 5, 1 through 15, the tradition of the pool at Bethesda. What's going on there? There's this one part where it just talks about how this angel would come and he would stir up the water. And whenever the angel would stir up the water, like the first jumper got healed. And so I wanted to touch on that a little bit because that does look like a funky thing for the Bible to talk about or say. And so Edwin A. Blum's commentary, which is also in the Bible Knowledge Commentary series, he says the earliest manuscripts omit these words, which appear to be a late insertion to explain why the pool water was stirred. People believed that an angel came and stirred it. According to local tradition, the first one in the water would be healed, but the Bible nowhere teaches this kind of superstition, a situation which would be a most cruel contest for many ill people. No extant Greek manuscript before AD 400 contains these words. The MacArthur Bible Commentary also states, the statement in the latter half of verse 3, waiting for the moving of the water, along with verse 4, are not original to the Gospel. The earliest and best Greek manuscripts, as well as the early versions, exclude the reading. So what I think is going on there, I think that you had a later copyist who was copying the Gospel, and that person added in a brief explanation for what was going on for the text to be clear to the reader. But it didn't make it actually clearer to the reader because it looks like maybe the Bible is endorsing this strange superstition. But I want to bring out a couple of things. One, these kinds of traditions, they exist in a lot of places. When I was in Mexico, there were a lot of people who would tell me about how you could go to this one particular set of springs. And if you drank from that water, that would heal like everything about you. And so they would go and they would collect this water and they would bring it to other places and they would sell it and they would keep it to drink for when they got sick. They attributed it to being from certain minerals that were in the water. But I have no doubt that there are a lot of traditions that say that there's a spiritual connection to some sort of a spring and this is going to give you healing. I don't think that's uncommon. These traditions exist, but they don't require a Christian to see them as from God. And I think that that's an interesting thing that's happening here in the text is Jesus doesn't endorse this tradition in any way. As a matter of fact, he never acknowledges the pool at all as having any kind of healing abilities. He doesn't like pick the guy up and do him a solid by chucking him in the pool, because he could have done that. He could have been like, ooh, the water's stirring. I'm going to throw you in first. I know you've been waiting for a long time. He doesn't do that. Instead, what Jesus does is he heals the guy. He never mentions an angel. He doesn't participate in this ritual at all. He just heals that man. And he does it in a public place, in a public way, to give the rest of the people who were there enough information about him that they could turn from trusting in an angel to trusting in the true healing water, which is Jesus Christ. And so you don't see him ever like putting his stamp on this kind of tradition. In fact, you see him supplanting it and just very casually almost showing his superiority to any possible power that these people could attribute to a pool. And so to speak just a little bit to the trustworthiness of the text you're reading, if you're reading in the 1-year chronological Bible, the New King James, there is a footnote. And it does say that those particular verses are omitted in the NU text, and then they're included in your text that you're reading, but it shows you that they're not in all of the texts. So the vast majority of what we're reading in the Bible is consistent from text to text. I'm talking 99% or more of what we read is absolutely consistent within all the manuscripts. There's maybe like a spelling here or there, because somebody's pen slipped. But other than that, it's totally consistent. So when you see something like this is not a reason to say, oh, I can't trust the Bible. We see where there was a place where there was something that was obviously added in just a little bit later, and we mark that. And so we're not going into this ignorant and saying, oh, no, we don't know about that. That's going to throw our faith off. No, this is still a very trustworthy document. If we just know in this one place there was an addition there that confused things. But it doesn't change anything about salvation. It doesn't change anything about who God is, anything like that. It's just a little piece of detail. Second one, John 5 and other places. After this guy, he goes and he picks up his mat, he's walking around with it. The Pharisees come and they're like, why are you walking around with your mat? It's the Sabbath. And they throw like this big giant tantrum about his mat. And so I wanted to touch on that because you see a very strong reaction over and over in the New Testament of these Pharisees that are attacking Jesus or attacking other people for violating the Sabbath, whether they are or not. They had interpreted the Bible for a long time in the Talmud and the Mishnah and all of their stuff to show what exactly violated the Sabbath and what did not. And they'd become very, very strict over it. And I think they actually had a good, solid reason why. In Nehemiah, one of the things that he emphasizes when he's bringing his reform over Jerusalem, he says, you guys are selling things on the Sabbath. This is part of the reason why God sent us into the exile in the first place. We have to make a covenant that we're going to shut the gates on the Sabbath and not let any merchants in, and we're not going to do this. There's that strong reaction of we have to avoid at any cost being sent into captivity again and bringing God's wrath down on us again. So I think when we look at the Pharisees, it would help us to look at them and see, like, these are people that know the story of the Bible, that know the story of Israel, that have meditated profoundly on what it says. And they've come to some conclusions based on that that are not altogether wrong. And so they say, maybe this Sabbath, when we break the Sabbath, that's part of that slippery slide down into breaking all of the rest of the scriptures and going back into idolatry and going back into captivity and losing our temple again. They're protecting their nation. And so I think it explains some of the vehemence of their reaction toward Jesus so frequently. These guys are seeing him as a threat to their national security, both on a secular level, because he could make the Romans angry, and on a spiritual level, because if he's leading people to break the Sabbath, then man, it's a downhill slope from there. We obviously know that Jesus came as the Lord of the Sabbath, but for their perspective, perhaps it helps us as we read about them to think these were people who wanted something good for their nation. They did it in the wrong way. They didn't recognize Jesus when he came in, but they wanted something good for their nation because they were afraid to displease the Lord again. There's a certain amount of zeal there that I think could be admirable, but they absolutely needed Christ. So, just a third one here, Mark 5, 1 through 20, Matthew 8, 28 through 34, Luke 8, 26 through 39. It's the story of the Gadarene demoniac, or the Gerasene demoniac. How many demoniacs were there? So, if you look carefully there, Luke and Mark talk about one. If you look, Matthew talks about two. So, this confused me quite a lot because I was in a class where the professor talked about, and I don't remember which professor, the professor talked about how Matthew frequently doubles things because he's writing to the Jews. And so he doubles things and because he's bringing that attention to this is the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so that confused me quite a lot because I thought, if he's doubling things, is he writing things that are not accurate, that didn't actually happen that way? And so kind of the best answer I've been able to find, Louis Barbieri notes that neither Mark nor Luke says that the demoniac is the only man who's there. It could be that he's the more violent, frightening one of the two, and so that's why he catches their attention, and they focus on him to the exclusion of the other. So it says in Matthew that there are 2. It doesn't say in Mark and Luke that there are not 2. So there's no real reason to say, oh, there definitely were not 2. So we do see Matthew taking special note of the appearance of 2 people in stories. He is writing to a Jewish audience. He does want to draw their attention to 2 or 3 witnesses wherever they appear in history. And this is something that you see in the Old Testament, which is Deuteronomy 17:6, 19:15. But then you also see in the New Testament where people took this quite seriously and they applied it in the church. And Jesus applied it as well in Matthew 18:16, 2 Corinthians 13:1, 1 Timothy 5:19, and Hebrews 10:28. And so you do see that 2 witnesses, and you see Matthew drawing attention to that, and that was also his apologetic to the Jews. So I hope this is useful, hope it's helpful, and I will see you next week.